Okay, so in the last video, I challenged you to go ahead and attempt to make what would be a query that allowed us to, well, actually use our routing system. Because right now, we hit the post, and while it's getting the ID, it's getting that from the parameters we're passing into the route itself. It's not actually doing a query with those or anything. So how can we actually go about hitting our API with our newfound actual post page? Right now, the post.js page is where we're going to be living, and we are using this .props.navigation.state.params.id. That's a mouthful. That is a long tree. But what we really just need to do is access this params.id and hit our API. Now, I want you to remember that GraphQL has its own way of doing things, and if you were to be setting up with a more customized version of GraphQL using the GraphQL framework, or perhaps you're just using something they call Prisma, which is their own sort of self-hosted thing, then you'll have a ton more control over everything. But using this basic version of GraphQL, everything sort of gets its name from its general system, and in this case, the query we need to write, which I challenge you to do, also got its name from, well, something that we did not necessarily define. Remember, we created post as the name of the, well, you could call it a collection or the schema, and that actually gives us access to a new query, which is a single post. So if we do a const, and let's just call this post query, and it's going to be equal to, now I need to import a bunch of my GraphQL stuff, so I can head to my post.js file and grab the GraphQL package as well as the GQL from GraphQL tag. Okay, and paste these in here. Let's actually move nav styles down a little bit to keep our local imports separate from our package imports. And let's go ahead and actually have GQL backticks, just like we've been doing, to define our GraphQL query. So in here we can say, hey, this is going to be a query. Okay, in our post query, we didn't give our query a name. In fact, we just had brackets. However, 99% of the time, you're going to want to give your queries a name. Now, we didn't do that at first simply just because it was easier not to. However, as you go, most of the time, you're going to want to be giving your queries a name. And we can define this as the post query. Now, again, this name right here, this is our own definition, and we're defining it simply by saying, hey, here's a new query named post. And this query needs to accept an ID, and that ID is going to be a type of ID. So what do we need inside of this defined query? Well, now we actually need to write our GraphQL query. Now, the GraphQL query that exists from GraphQL is simply post with a capital P. And this, again, is going to, it's going to need an ID, right? And the ID that passes in here is going to be the ID that gets passed into our query. Now, this is kind of a confusing topic, but this is sort of like defining a function, and this is the arguments that it accepts, and this is what it's looking for. And this is sort of like calling the function. This isn't a one-to-one example here, but you can think about it like this. Here, we're calling a function called post, where the ID is going to be equal to this brand new argument that we just passed in here, which is going to be an ID. Okay, now next we want to output some stuff. We want to output the ID, obviously, because we always like an ID. We'll want to output the title, and that's pretty much all we have right now. We haven't added a body to these posts quite yet. That's going to be once we actually get writing our mutations and stuff like that. Okay, so this is the information we want. Now, if you remember from our posts.js, we needed to attach the query into our export here by a high order component GraphQL. Now, I'm not going to copy and paste this because I want to actually show you how we kind of do some of this stuff here to get our variable into our query. So let's do a few things. I'm going to remove this export default from the class. I'm going to cut this query from above our component. I'm going to paste it down here just to get it out of the way. I'm going to do an export default, and then we can have post, okay? Because post is the name of our component. So cool, we have export default post. Now we need to once again use our GraphQL component wrapper here to have a function that wraps the post like this. Now let's talk about what actually needs to happen inside of this wrapper. We're first going to need to pass in our post query to say, hey, this is our post query, right? This is what we need to run. But this exclamation point next to the ID says, hey, we need an ID. And obviously we want to pull that ID from this.props.navigate, this whole long string here, right? So where do we do that? We do that right here as the second argument to our GraphQL, and we just have a comma here, and this is now going to be an object. Inside of this object, we're once again want to say props is a property that's going to be equal to an arrow function with an object that just says data like this. You could copy this line directly from the other component if you wanted to. I usually do, to be honest. Remember, this is going to assign each of these props that come in as individual props rather than within the data object. Not something you need to do, but something I like to do. And then next we want to pass in options, which is something we haven't seen before in a query, but we can have an options property that is going to have a function in here. Now, the function is going to, well, look like this. It's going to be an arrow function here. Let me do this super bare bones first, and then we can expand upon it as we need. And it's simply going to return an object. Okay. Now, one of the things we have access to is our props. So we now are going to be able to take from our props what you can imagine is our props.navigation.state. All this stuff, right? So a better way to do that would be to just have a bracket here to do a little bit of diving into this object. And we can just say, hey, give us the navigation. And now we're going to assign what's called variables. Variables are where you determine the things that get passed into your query right here. If you have multiple properties, such as ID and body or title or whatever, you would have each of those inside of this object. So our variables property is going to be an object like I just mentioned, and the value we're going to be adding in is an ID. Now again, we have access to navigation, so let's actually copy this whole string from navigation onwards, navigation.state.params.id, like this. So check it out here. What we have going on is a situation where we are having to use our post query. We're assigning the data that comes back as props. But in our query, we're saying, hey, we got some options in this query. These options are going to be the fact that we're assigning variables. The variables that we're assigning come directly from the props that get passed into this component. One of those props is navigation.state.params.id. And we're assigning that to an ID variable that then gets passed into our post query, which is going to hit GraphQL to grab our current post ID and title. Now, if we check this out here, we should be able to see that instead of this.props.navigation.state.params.id, again, that's a mouthful, we're now able to access this.post post.id. So let's go ahead and see this thing in action. And for good measure too, let's actually just throw in the title as well, this.post.title. Okay, that way we can have both of our items output here. We can definitively see that this thing is working differently than it was before. So let's head to our application, and let's go ahead and just select one of our items. Now here we're actually getting an interesting error. Could not find the client in the context of Apollo Post. Wrap the root component in Apollo Provider. Now, if you haven't worked much with Apollo, this might be sort of confusing. So let's think about this for a minute here. If we have our application, in which we do at app.js, it's wrapped around Apollo Provider. Next, we are using our stack navigator to display the app screen for our home. However, the post screen is going to be using the post screen. This goes to show you that the app screen itself is actually what's being wrapped in the Apollo Provider and not the post screen. And this is something that can happen simply just by, the differences between how navigation works in something like React Router and how something works in React Native with this React navigation package. Concerning, you should see that when one active page is loaded, this isn't a subroute of home, it's its own page. Well, so how do we fix this? The main thing is going to be that our stack navigator, this entire business, is going to need to be the main thing inside of our Apollo provider. Instead of the other way around, right now Apollo provider is just a single item in Stack Navigator rather than, well, the encompassing all of Stack Navigator. So let's go ahead and head to our file structure and let's create a new file. And since this is mostly just going to be our navigator, I'm going to just call this navigator, okay? Navigator, okay? Make sure everything's spelled nice and good. And let's actually head back to our app.js. From here, I'm simply going to cut this entire Stack Navigator out of here. I'm going to paste it in here. Now let's think about what stuff we need to actually import out of here. We need to come up top. We need to import the post page. So let's cut that one out of here. So post, right? So that's now defined. We also need to import app. And, well, this is app right here. So you can see we have a little bit of a mess that we need to clean up. We also need to import Stack Navigator. So let's cut that out of there as well and just paste this in here into Stack Navigator. Now let's actually copy some more stuff. I'm going to copy this entire component to the bottom where we had our stylesheet.create. This is getting a little messy, but it's going to be clean in no time, and we can paste this in here. Next, I'm going to do some modifications on both of these. Okay, you don't have to copy and paste. We could have done this from scratch really if we wanted to, but we could call this home. Class home extends React component. Next, we want to make sure we output home inside of our Stack Navigator. If we scroll down here, we don't want the screen to be app anymore. We want it to be home. So we now have a home screen and we now have a post screen. The home is simply just going to need to be the view that we had in here before. Okay? Just like this. Check it out. Now we're going to need to import a bunch of stuff. I'm quite aware of that. So let's make sure we do that before we wrap up this component. We're going to want all of the React stuff that we had from our other component without any of the Apollo stuff. So our navigator is going to import React. It's going to import style sheet, text, view, and button. And it doesn't need button. We're not using it. And it's technically not using text either, so let's get rid of those. Okay, so we can see we are importing React, style sheet, and view, and Stack Navigator and post. Our navigator is going to contain both our home screen as well as our post screen. If you wanted to refactor this out even more, you could just take this entire component and put it in its home file. Maybe we'll do that before the end of this series. Next, we're going to head back to our app file where we can start deleting a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to delete all of this React Native stuff, and I'm going to leave this stuff. I'm also going to cut out the nav styles that we had in here and import it again into our navigator file. And then let's head back here. And again, our posts, I'm going to cut that out of here and import it into our navigator. These are all things that are defined in this file now. Okay, so check it out. Let's head back to our app.js. We're going to keep Apollo client. And we're going to just actually keep this class app extends React component, except this time we're going to do an export default. And now we're going to nuke out basically everything. Okay, we're going to nuke out the styles. We're going to delete everything except for the Apollo provider. And now inside of our Apollo provider, we're going to simply have our navigator, which we're going to want to import. So we're going to import navigator from /navigator. Again, folder structure on this thing is abysmal right now. We will fix it. And then we're going to have just like this. Okay, so that was a pretty long-winded way to make this change, but what we did here is instead of having our navigator be the main entry to our application like it was before, the Apollo provider is now the main entry to our application, and the navigator is just a child of it. And the navigator is then going to say, hey, here's the home view, and it's the initial screen, but then there's also a post screen as well. Both of those should now be wrapped in the Apollo provider. We head back to our app, we click on a post, and we get another error. This is just the way of life at this point. If you were keen, you'd know exactly what this error is. We are trying to access this stuff immediately, but we aren't waiting for the API to come back. So we could do something like a const and then define our post, but we can also bring in a property of loading. You remember that we had the same concept in this initial one where we brought in loading. So let's go ahead and also do that is equal to this dot props. Now we can return null if loading is equal to true. Now this should be the last red arrow that we get. Now check it out. We're going to hit our post, and you can see that we now have the ID as well as the text string output. Now this is awesome. So in this video, we learned a few things. We learned that one, all of our components need to be wrapped around an Apollo provider. And you don't want to have multiple Apollo providers here. You want one all-encompassing Apollo provider. Two, we also learned that you can pass in arguments into your queries using this syntax right here. And we also learned about naming our queries, which is something we haven't done yet either. Naming your queries will make them easier to debug. And in this case, if you're using variables, you need to use named queries. Okay, so check it out. We are now outputting actual post data into our project. And we can navigate back and forth. We can load a new one, and each time it's going to hit that API and grab our post. Now, this is really super exciting, but how exciting would it be if, well, these posts were actually new posts that we were able to write ourselves? So in the next video, we're going to create our form that is going to allow us to submit new posts. And in the video after that, we're going to actually write a mutation that allows us to submit new posts while actually updating the query and getting a whole bunch of new posts back, having the update work nice like that. Okay, and then from there, we're going to go and talk about editing. We're going to be talking about some of the navigator stuff. We're going to clean up these styles a whole bunch in this thing, because let's face it, this isn't the prettiest app on the planet. And we're going to get them attached to user accounts. So as always, this is Scott. Fire up the next one as we start to create our form for our posts.